news was this month. December last year. The EU and China had the first major in-person meeting they've had since 2019. You're the expert on this. What are some of the biggest things that have come out of that meeting?
All right, it was the first time that they had met, as you pointed out, in about 4 years. And the previous meeting, the High Representative Joseph Borrell described it as a dialogue of the deaf. So this year's meeting had very, very low expectations. Neither side even agreed to having a joint statement or any deliverables. So it was more like, let's keep the lines of communication open. Nevertheless, I think that the media tried to portray it in a more positive light, but they inevitably were compared to the US-China meeting in California and what happened in Beijing. And it appears that the Europeans were much tougher on the Chinese. So the threat of sanctions on electric vehicles coming into Europe is something that the Chinese are really against. But we've seen a doubling in the balance of payments. So it's 400 billion, a little over 400 billion. So it doubled in 2 years. So it's astronomical. And the Europeans are more dependent on Chinese trade than the US. The US is about 16.5%, and the Europeans are about 20% reliant on Chinese trade. And the other issue that the Chinese and the Europeans are always trying to distinguish themselves differently from the United States. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, uses the language de-risking rather than decoupling. And she tries to reassure her Chinese counterparts that it's not so bad. But when I speak to Chinese officials here in Brussels, they see it as the same thing. The outcome is the same. Becoming or trying to become less dependent on China in certain key areas. So I think that overall, there hasn't been a big change in relations. The trajectory was downward even before COVID. But kind of their go-to person in Europe, Chancellor Angela Merkel, is no longer in power. So I think they're kind of looking for their next Merkel, but it's very difficult for them right now. And Chinese officials, when I speak with them, they're pretty realistic that ever since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we're coming up to the second anniversary of that. They see that the Europeans perceive China-Russia strategic convergence. So the Chinese understand that they're really not going to make a lot of headway with Europe, and they're just, kind of going along with things. The other is that there are two red lines for the Europeans. One is that they do not want to see China help Russia with Ukraine. So clearly China buys Russian oil, and that helps Putin have enough money to fuels the war in Ukraine. And also there's an ambassador for sanctions. There have been about 11 suites of sanctions on Russia, but now they're discovering a lot of dual-use goods made in China found on the battlefield in Ukraine. So between 70 and 80% of the items are from China. So the question is, if Beijing's really crossing this red line, no one seems to have the will to take them to task on this. So the Europeans continue to repeat, we don't want you to do anything more to support Russia. In fact, I called it peace washing. In the early days of the war, Joseph Borrell was saying things like, only China can help us mediate this war. And so, so that is kind of the card that they try to play. But that's pretty much where we stand today.
So there's a lot that you talked about that I want to unpack, but in terms of what dual-use equipment China is sending to Russia, what are we seeing in terms of that support for Russia's war on Ukraine?
Okay, there's drones, there's some vehicles, also some armaments have been discovered on the battlefield. Some will say, oh, these are from old stocks. We don't know who sold them to the Ukrainians or to the Russians. They could just be very, very ancient Chinese armaments. We're not selling it to them right now. But the narrative from the Chinese is that we don't really have control over these things. Some of these companies are, private sector, so we really don't know what they're doing. And it's clear that they obviously do know what they're doing, because the private sector in this area of armaments does not, cannot operate independently of Chinese Communist Party supervision. So I think that this is a worrying design. And I think that I had an opportunity to ask the High Representative Joseph Borrell why he continues to use this narrative, like we need China to help us and use their influence on Russia, because, after almost 2 years, it's clear that that's not happening. And his response to me was that, well, it could be worse. So the Europeans are thinking if China just, drops all pretense and starts really selling very high level weapons, that's what the Europeans want to try to prevent. But I think that,
but won't China not do that? Because if China drops all the pretense, then the EU and the US politically basically have to sanction China.
That's right.
So from the Communist Party's perspective,
why give them that position of negotiating power when really they can't pull that card? That would be devastating for China. It's really the U.S. and Europe that are in a position of power and really could stand to demand more from the Chinese Communist Party.
That's the thing. Europe is a huge trade partner of China. And I think that they're always like flummoxed and confused because they think, well, we're your trade partner. We have leverage over you. And under the recent developments in Beijing, it's clear that strategy trumps economics. So the Europeans haven't been very good at using their leverage either over the Chinese. And now they've created some new instruments, for example, a non-coercion instrument, which will take place this month in January. And there are other foreign direct investment screening that's been around for a while, but it really hasn't successfully been implemented, according to my analysis. For example, Chancellor Scholz was warned, not to sell part of the key strategic port in Germany to the Chinese, and he did. So it's only 24.9%. It was just under the 25% level. But it seems that some of these instruments, they look great on paper, but in reality, if a government leader wants to sell strategic industry to a Chinese company, they will go ahead. So I think that, yes, they're improving their toolbox to try to make their economy more resilient and more economically strategic. They are trying to screen what's coming into Europe and also what outbound investment. That's another key area for Europe, because they're kind of the tech piggy bank for the Chinese Communist Party. The more the US ratchets up sanctions and makes it more difficult to export high-level goods to China, they are looking to Europe to buy things there. So the US is kind of asking them to put in place some exports controls. And this will be an area, I think, that will be key for transatlantic relations.